Misinformation is not a form of information. It's falsity masquerading as information. The difference between misinformation and disinformation is the difference between ignorance and fraud. Those who communicate misinformation will state something they believe to be true even though it is not. Those who communicate misinformation are misinformed. Those who communicate disinformation are informed. They know that what they are saying is false, but they communicate this false information anyways. There's nothing new about misinformation or disinformation. Ignorance and dishonesty are components of the human condition. What is new is digital platforms, the internet, social media. Before the internet, information was mediated. Books, newspapers, radio, TV were intermediaries between the sources of claimed information and the public. Misinformation and disinformation, which was obvious to the media, was not replicated. With the internet, this mediation has disappeared. Today, anyone with misinformation or disinformation can, through the internet, digital platforms, and social media, communicate globally without mediation. The social media and say have terms of service which can prevent or take down disinformation and misinformation. Their mediation works often ineffectively and sometimes not at all. The question we face at this conference and at this panel is what to do about it. The problem about technology, as we've seen in other forms again and again, is the technology. I've been myself involved in Holocaust-related issues most of my working life. What was new about the Holocaust was not anti-Semitism, which had existed since prehistoric times. Indeed, anti-Semitism is a classic example of prehistoric disinformation and misinformation. What was new about the Holocaust was rodeo, microphones, trains, machine guns, tanks, poison gas. Those who developed these technologies, it's fair to say, never imagined that they would have been used for genocide of Jews. Even Zyklon B, the poison gas used in the gas chambers, was developed as a pesticide. The result was that the precautions that should have been in place were not in place. It was only after World War II that a structure was developed to respond to this conjunction of an old hatred with new responses. After World War II, we saw the creation of the United Nations, the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, the Refugee Convention, the Geneva Convention on the Loss of War, the Nuremberg Tribunal, and so on. This story has been repeated time and time again, both before and after the Holocaust, with a variety of new technologies. Now, with the internet, digital platforms, and social media, we have again a new technology, a technological paradigm shift. Those who developed the technologies, it's fair to say, like the developers of past technologies, presumably never imagined the abuse and harm to which they've been put. The result is that here again, we're playing catch-up. The question this panel addresses is how we catch up to counter the problem of the mass spread of misinformation and disinformation that the internet has generated. Okay, so now let's start with Zois.
Okay, thank you for the nice introduction. I'm very glad here and discussing this important topic. So as David mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the math and stat department. So I mainly though work on data science problems. And one of the problems I'm working with is misinformation detection. So I'm going to talk a little bit about misinformation detection from an AI perspective or a data science perspective. I think it's better to call it data science perspective. And what the challenges we face there and so on. So I'll start first, which I think it's the most important topic, with the definition of misinformation and disinformation. And I should say here that within the data science community, misinformation and disinformation is not defined. It's a surprise, I guess. Yeah. I'll explain why it's not defined. And there is a important reason from a data science perspective why it is not clearly defined. In data science also, when we work with misinformation data, we say, okay, we can work with propaganda data. We can work with hoax data. We can work with trolls and so on. all of them we cast them under misinformation. So in order for machine learning to work and create a system that can actually effectively detect misinformation, what we need, the first ingredient we need for that system is data. And unfortunately, the data that we need should be also labeled, because we need to actually train the system and explain, okay, that this piece of information that you will receive has been actually labeled as misinformation or class A or class B. And it's a typical classification problem, in other words, from a machine learning perspective. So the reason why we do not define misinformation very precisely or disinformation is because we do not have a lot of data. And as you all know now, in order for a machine learning or deep learning algorithm to work, it needs a good amount or a huge amount of data, labeled data. And again, the reason why we do not have, why we do not define this information or misinformation, would not distinguish, is because we don't have from each category that much data that can be fed into a machine learning algorithm and be trained effectively. So to begin with, then, what we do, we say that we cast everything under misinformation, and we use all of this data to train an algorithm, or at least this is what is happening within the last year. Next, I'm gonna go to a couple of other challenges that I feel are very important when we work with this type of problem. So the first challenge, we call it multimodality. So the data that is present in social media. So a single post, for example, can be represented in multiple ways, in multiple modalities. So that could be either text, that could be either an image, that could be either a video, and so on. And within a social media post, you can see all of the different modalities at the same time. So when you just read the text, nothing could be suspicious, right? So the system doesn't detect anything. But when you combine the text with an image, then probably the message or the social media post could be actually dangerous for the harmony of the society and so on. So from a machine learning perspective, it is really important to actually come up with new ways to digest the data in a holistic way and train the algorithm how to understand important aspects from the data using all the different modalities of the data. Another challenge, I would say, is imbalance in the data. So right now, when we talk about misinformation or disinformation, what we say is we do have a lot of data from, let's say, trusty social media posts, but very small portion of misinformation or disinformation. And one could easily imagine that taking all of this data, and even if they are labeled from a human annotator, and give it to a machine and let the machine decide, this is an inherent imbalance problem, and the machine cannot easily learn. So when the machine is going to actually test the performance and make a real prediction, it will always actually predict any given post as a reliable post. So in the machine learning community, one aspect is that how do we actually train systems and make them able to handle imbalancing the data. I think the next challenge, which I believe is also the key step for the future, is how do you integrate a human into a system? At this point, we are just talking about a system that a human is only there to train it using data and then test it. But at this point, we would like to also have a human in the loop and evaluate actually the output at the same time, and even improve further the performance of a given algorithm. So this has a particular name. From a labeling perspective, it's called active learning. So we can teach the machine how to take human input and give good labels for the data, or have the human in the loop while the system is deployed and running in live. How can we actually even improve the system performance with new data coming in. And this probably takes me to the next challenge, which is we call them out of vocabulary terms or words. So, but imagine a system that is trained to actually detect misinformation during a high impact event. That could be elections, that could be um, a terrorist attack, perhaps. Okay, the system knows that if, let's say, we say something misleading about a particular nation, that will flag this particular tweet as misinformation or disinformation. But what if now we have a completely new event with completely new terms? Will the system still be able to actually predict or make meaningful predictions? So this is another challenge that people are working on, and again, at this point here, most of those systems fail when we have a lot of out of vocabulary words, when we just shift from one event to another. So I guess I have time for one more minute. Okay, one more minute. Last, and then I close here with go to the next speaker. Maybe I should say education is the next step for us to consider. I think people, instead of having just a system to detect, make meaningful predictions, I think what we need is to actually educate people how to evaluate and just talk about this in education, make enforcement, and uh, I believe even legalize certain things about social media. Okay,
Thank you.
hi, it's me.
Right, I'm gonna keep my phone near me just so I don't go over. Is it on? It's on? Okay, great. So thanks so much. I think we have a few similar ideas that we were going to discuss, and I'm going to try to put a different spin on it. So we all know that misinformation and disinformation is a problem online. I mean, it's clear. It's something that we think about in a lot of different contexts. But I think one thing to remember, particularly with the U.S. population, is that over 80% of the U.S. population, according to a Pew survey done recently, looks online for their news and information. And so, if so much of the population is collecting their knowledge from online sources, we have to find ways and think about ways to protect those sources and to give and provide as much high quality information as possible. So I think a lot about this. And when I first started thinking about this was in 2016 during the election. And that was really my first exposure to the impact of low quality information online at such massive scale. We were running a study with Gallup, and the study asked the following question. It was a survey question, and it said, "What have you read, seen, or heard about each candidate, about Trump or about Clinton in the last few days?" And so every week, every day actually in 2016, I was getting information that people were sharing about what they had read, seen, or heard about each of these candidates. And so, I was paying attention to the newspapers, I was paying attention to everything. But what was so amazing to me was what the public was remembering. And what the public was remembering about Donald Trump was something different every week. Immigration, women, the debate, this or that. It didn't matter. It just varied every single week. It didn't matter how good or bad it was different. But with Hillary Clinton, outside of the debates, the only thing they remembered about her was her email. At almost any point, that was what was stuck with her, no matter what, whether they were pro or against or whatever, it was her email. And if that information sticks, it's really hard to move forward and give some high quality information around that. And what's even more interesting is if you look at traditional newspapers, they were not talking about email. It was social media, right? And so that also goes back to the notion of who are the sources that provide the information, and what about these sources where there's no regulation or anyone can put anything up? How do we think about them? How do we determine credibility and reliability of news sources that are emerging continuously? So when I think about misinformation, I think about it from 2016 because that was my first big exposure to it. And of course, as a computer scientist, one of the first things I ask myself is, well, how the heck do I detect this? This is really hard to do. And if we look at the state of the art that's out there, most misinformation research has focused on, particularly on social media, has focused on myth level or topic level detection. And it makes perfect sense, or sources. So, sources is one area, but the other area is myth level or topic level if you're looking at content. And there are excellent reinforcement learning algorithms that are out there that do pretty well. But I want to go back to a point that was made earlier, which is how do you do this in real time? As new myths are emerging, and the vocabulary of those new myths are not part of your vocabulary set. This is a huge challenge that we can't ignore, particularly when there's a pandemic or an election or an event that really does bring new vocabulary to our daily lives. So I'd like us to kind of think and ponder a little bit about that. So given that we have LLMs now and we have all this generative AI around, one might think, oh, well, why don't we use generative AI to help us with this lack of training data that we have and find ways to use it to actually help with this problem? Since we already know that those who are adversaries are going to try to use it to proliferate misinformation, right? So how can we do that? And there have been a number of recent studies that have shown that if you just directly fine tune a lot of these different large language models, they do not perform as well as if you use one of these reinforcement learning models that uses both strong and weak learners within them, and unless the myth that you are interested in is very well defined, right? So the broader the myth or claim, the worse it is at being able to help you generate meaningful training data or sufficient training data for that case. And the case example I'll use for you is a COVID example. If the myths are around weather is very clear. There's very clear words that are and concepts that are around weather. It does very well. If, on the other hand, it's around home remedies where, garlic or whatever can cure COVID, those types of myths it does much poorly on because of the diversity of the myths that are associated with that topic. So that's something that's really important to think about as we think about using generative AI to help us tackle this issue with meeting training data. And I do think, though, that we can smartly use generative AI and different Gen AI technologies to generate data that can be used as part of weak learners or possibly even active learners that can then be combined with strong learners together to actually get the answer out. And so I think that's a really important strategy to consider. The other thing is, why not just ask the chatbot, is this true or false? That seems like a really smart, logical thing to do right away, right? So we did this. We did a big study just asking chatbots about encyclopedia questions, about current events, and about misinformation. Does really well on encyclopedia questions, as you might guess. Does okay on current events. Does really poorly on misinformation topics. So it does matter what you're asking. It may get better over time, but it probably won't because the LLMs aren't informed rapidly enough. Their knowledge bases are always a few weeks or a few months old. Um, and then I think the last thing I think I want to get at is so as computer scientists, we think a lot about the technologies to help detect misinformation and maybe even to understand the spread of misinformation and the different patterns. Or does election misinformation disseminate in a similar way as health misinformation? Are the sources similar and so on? The answer from our research is that the sources are quite different. But I'm also really interested in us thinking about strategies about how we can inform the public about poor quality information. Are there technology strategies that we can think about? We know that there are strategies that have been used by social media companies like community notes or corrections types of strategies or interventions where you share facts broadly and disseminate those broadly on social media. And those are all really important strategies. But what's the next generation of strategies? What's the next generation that we as computer scientists and social scientists and academics and those who care about information diffusion more broadly can come up with and think about that actually connect to people, that make people think more about the information and perhaps educate them without them even realizing they're being educated on the topic. Because I agree that education is something we really need to think about as these new technologies are being shared with everyone. And then, yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Jordan.
Well, this is great. Hi everybody, I'm Rubin, and I'm loving hearing this. And I'm actually engaged with some people right now, and we're talking about uh, information, disinformation in the political space. So, for a little bit more of my bio, thanks to Dr. Obler, to Andre for including me here today. I work quite actively in public policy space, in the political space, and advocacy space. And so in the way, I'm kind of a consumer of some of what we're talking about, or try not to be a consumer of what we're talking about as well, engaged in this discussion right now on the panel. I kept on blowing around in my head. What happens if your elected leaders, your politicians, your public servants are actively engaged in disinformation spreading? Imagine, could that be? Have we seen that before? So what happens if it's not an algorithmic issue, it's a human issue where a human is actively choosing to disinform? Now, when I think about disinformation, vice misinformation, I think of the intent to undermine our institutions and our democracy as a sort of overall definition. One disinforms in the political arena because they are trying to weaken, undermine, and subvert Americans, in this case, confidence in our institutions that may be the media, may be a government agency, maybe nonprofits, the root of law, the courts, some just we'll put it as institutions that provide guidance and clarity and steering to our society. And so disinformation seeks to subvert that. Now, there's some recent examples, and I'll get into some of the bigger ones, but recent examples, even this past week, we've seen disinformation. Disinformation, for example, about FEMA and the use of, or the ability of FEMA to help people in North Carolina who've suffered from a hurricane. And disinformation was used for a political purpose to weaken American support or belief in the institutions that were coming to protect them after a cataclysmic weather event. Why? For political objectives of the disinformers. There's another disinformation dynamic out there that is now getting a response from Congress on a Tucker Carlson show, because Holocaust is referenced. I'll bring it up. A Holocaust revisionist spoke on a podcast of Tucker Carlson, got about 30 million views of Americans now thinking different things about the roots of the Holocaust and the Nazi triggering of World War II. And so much so that now there are resolutions in Congress condemning that disinformation. The big one, of course, is we're talking about in 2016, and which is all I'm getting to today. I want to read a quick quote about it, is disinformation by foreign adversaries who seek to undermine Americans' confidence in our institutions or democratic process, seek to support one candidate over another. It's very clear Russia has been identified and indicted by the Justice Department only last month for funneling tens of millions of dollars into American social media apparatus and to podcasters who are influencers in conservative spaces. And they did not disclose that. And so they were found out. They were found out by an institution who's fighting back, right? An institution, the Justice Department, fighting back. I'll read a quote of the FBI Director Chris Wray, who is a Republican, mind you, in the indictment of about a month ago against these efforts. Quote, covert attempts to sow division and trick Americans into unwittingly consuming foreign propaganda represents attacks on our democracy, said FBI Director Wray. Today's actions show that as long as foreign adversaries like Russia keep engaging in hostile influence campaigns, they're going to keep running into the FBI. We'll continue to do everything we can to expose the hidden hand of foreign adversaries like Russia and to disrupt their efforts to meddle in our free and open society. So for me, from the practitioner's spins, when we see disinformation, we see it as an attempt to undermine our institutions and our democracy for a nefarious purpose by, in this case, a country that has challenges and conflicts with the United States and does not want to see us engage in a policy that they don't like. Therefore, they can undermine it and, frankly, advocate for politicians who may be more friendly to them. So, the three lessons I take out of this, so just sort of close with this. One, it's happening in the political environment all the time. It's a common topic. It's brought up at every meeting I'm in with Democratic strategists, with activists, you name it. Everybody's talking about how to deal with and cope with disinformation because in a political environment, activists and advocates are trying to get their information out, and now they have to deal with algorithms suppressing their ideas and promoting other ideas and disinforming the public. Very frustrating, very difficult to have a clean democracy when you're up against that. The second is, of course, facts and truth matter. They always do. I love the idea of asking GPT what is true. Is it true or not? That would be great if we could have a truth barometer out there. I think, for example, of the news today that and over recent days that I'm picking on, but why not? The Trump campaign, they don't want fact checkers at any debates or discussions. They reject the fact checkers. Why? Wonder why. Why would you be upset with the fact checker? Means maybe you can't disinform perpetually. And then the third one is, again, Russia, Iran, China, other foreign adversaries are deliberately utilizing our tools against us. Now, this sort of boomerang effect of our technology, where they have an open society, where we've created social media platforms, where we are allowing the world to engage in a free, open dialogue on a repetitive, ongoing basis. Those are also vulnerable systems. And adversaries that have closed societies that do not develop these technologies are leveraging against us ourselves here in the United States, and our ability to have a free and fair and open dialogue is being undermined, and Americans' confidence in our institutions and our democracy. So I'll close with that and say it's very real. Thanks, Andre, for the opportunity to speak.
Okay, thank you. On the last panelist is Maike.
Thank you very much. So I'm Maike Luiken. I'm from Canada, and I will try to be a little bit apolitical. I usually speak about sustainability and climate change, and normally not in the context of misinformation or disinformation and so on. So I'm going to be a little bit slower because this is the very first time I'm actually doing this. So it's not, doesn't come natural. So, of course, misinformation is a huge problem when we're talking about existential issues. And climate change, my opinion, is a existential issue. And if we talk to the scientific community, climate change is definitely real, about 95%, 98%, depending on which year you ask the question. So the full context is climate change, yes. What do we need to do to adapt to the effects, the impact? And what can and need to do in order to mitigate further climate change? So that's sort of the context that I usually talk about. The question that comes up here is, how can we make the best decisions without solid and trusted information? Because we could have solid information, don't trust it means nothing, right? All right, so let's have a look then, and I had to work with notes here, to the opportunities that we have and the barriers to actually take proper action to avoid a climate disaster. Okay, so the barriers. Misinformation and incorrect information at the time of use, of course, leads to bad decisions, actions, and mistrust. But it's not only that. I went on my first large not a convention, small group of people, 4 days, 40, 50 people in a room, $8,000 charged per person on sustainability. And at that time, this was after the Al Gore movie came out, there was a lot of question about climate change, real, not real, sustainability an issue or not. What was also true in the Canadian public was that public television would always give 50-50 time for like climate change is real, climate change is not real discussions. They would never interview somebody on one side only, always 50-50. As far as I'm concerned, that is a misconcept or bad concept of fairness. Because at that time already, at least 80% of the scientific community had like fully bought into, fully supported the vital importance of dealing with climate change and looking at the numbers. So what I'm saying is misplaced fairness doesn't help us either in terms of making the right decisions. So let's talk about a few of these misconceptions. So, well, climate change has always happened. Why are we worrying about it? Well, yeah, climate has always been changing, and at some point in history, like some 50 million years ago, very rapidly and led to a major catastrophe. And right now, we are changing the atmosphere even faster than during that catastrophe. So the composition of the atmosphere. So we have really something to look at. So this whole idea that, well, it has always been changing is misinformation. And related to that is the concept that weather and climate is a thing. Weather is local, today, tomorrow, a week, 3 weeks, a year. Climate is at least looked at it at a time frame of about 30 years. Related to that is that we are talking about, and we mentioned it today, the global warming piece around 1.5 degrees. Well, that is the average. Those are not the extremes. This is the average over a long time. Related to that is the information about water vapor. Water vapor has an awful lot to do with those heavy weather events that you have in Florida and further out in other states. Because with every degree of warming, in the average, around the globe, the water vapor content goes up by 7%. But people say water vapor is not a greenhouse gas. Actually, it's very potent, but it only lasts for about 14 days. Okay? So all of these pieces link together and are misconceptions, misinformation, incorrectly understood, and so on and so on, and lead us to either inactivity or wrong activity, wrong decisions. Of course, then there is green wishing and greenwashing. We all know about those. Let's look at some other pieces. The greenhouse effect. Those of you who are interested in astronomy know about Venus. It boils under the greenhouse effect. But the greenhouse effect actually, which means we are trapping heat in the atmosphere by the makeup of the atmosphere, the chemical, molecular, and so on makeup, has allowed the development of our current biosphere, or at least the biosphere, let's say, before the Industrial Revolution. If we didn't have the greenhouse effect that is helping to trap heat around the Earth, we would be about 33 degrees C less than what we were at the average before the Industrial Revolution, is about 15 degrees C. So it'd be freezing everywhere. And life would be totally different. So the greenhouse effect is not caused by humans. That is the understanding today, or the misconception. The greenhouse effect is natural. What is not given by nature, but has been caused by humans, is that we have been changing the chemical composition in the atmosphere. So we have more greenhouse trapping molecules in the atmosphere. Sorry, more heat trapping, my apologies, molecules in the atmosphere. There's a whole number of other misconceptions. I've got a long list, and I'm probably running out of time here. So there are other misconceptions around the information generation or spreading side. Like let's talk about nuclear power. Nuclear power generation is going to be part of the answer to having clean power, to much larger extent than we have it today. But nuclear power has generated a lot of fear. We've had a couple of major accidents like Chernobyl, 38 years ago. Yeah, 86. Okay, so but if you really look at statistics, nuclear power, the use of nuclear power and the mining of uranium and so on, has caused far less harm than the use of coal for power generation, for example. So again, a piece of misinformation and disinformation. So let's go to the other side, the opportunities. So we need to make good decisions as individuals, as societies, as companies. And so that means we need up-to-date climate science, up-to-date engineering, finance, severe weather, statistics, and so on. Up-to-date, transparent, and accessible information in the language that people and target audiences can understand. Because what we are trying to do is we try to drive a culture shift. If you look at our society, we have been starting to make technology work for us. Then we made it safe for us, like the do no harm piece. And now we have to make it sustainable, because we do want a long-term, sustainable, healthy planetary biosphere. Next then, so we need the information, we need to make the right decisions. And now I'm coming back to two of my fellow panelists, and that means education. Accessible education for individuals to identify what works for them to address this challenge. We need to engage across disciplines. It is a societal system problem. So like with this Planet Positive 2030 initiative I'm leading. We have an initiative called SUSTEC in FDC, in the future directions committee. We need standards, we need regulation, we need behavior by professionals and everybody, really, that we are actually responsible to keep ourselves up to date so that we can make the right decisions. And I mentioned earlier that we are working on one standard, a recommended practice for professionals to include climate change and environmental stewardship and so on, and sustainability information considerations in their professional practice. And with that, I'd like to conclude and hand over to our moderator.
Okay, thank you very much. What I'm going to do now is ask each of the panelists a question, and then I'll leave it open for questions from the people that are attending, and by Zoom through chat. So a question I have for Zois is, what do you see the future of misinformation detection heading, especially with the advancement of machine learning and human-assisted approaches?
Okay. I think the answer was already in the panel. So I feel that as the data science is evolving, it needs to be integrated into low level or high school or even middle school curriculum. It needs to be educated from a high level perspective. Um, in other words, education actually is in one word, education is the answer to this. And I think that especially the very young generations, um, we need to actually improve on awareness, and we need to educate them about society, how it is structured, um, what democracy means, real democracy means, what freedom of expression means, and along with technological advancements, they will actually bring a better future.
Okay, thank you very much. For Liz's theme, I want to ask, what is the state of art of misinformation detection in low resource environments?
Thanks so much. So as has been mentioned a few times, one of the difficulties with misinformation detection is the lack of training data that exists. And so, in general, particularly if you look at misinformation detection in other languages that are potentially low resourced, but in general, you tend to have insufficient amount of training data or very imbalanced data. And so I think so far what we've seen is systems that are able to mix together multiple types of learners and even look at the problem in a more multimodal way are actually more state of the art. So, as an example, there's a system called DEMIS that focuses on using fact checkers to identify different types of real world data that is talking about a specific claim and has a reinforcement learning model that determines whether or not these posts or other pieces of information actually are broadly about the claim, and then uses their more well trained or the training data that's been human labeled in conjunction with this reinforcement learner to decide whether or not to put it into the model. So those types of approaches that have these weak learning components or the human in the loop components that have been mentioned before are really the state of the art because they allow for deviations from just the basic training data that's labeled that you're aware of. It allows you to actually see more of the world of data that is related to that myth or that topic.
Okay, thanks. Joel, I wanted to ask you about misinformation in the coming U.S. election and what the impact you see that having, if any.
Thanks so much. I mean, we're clearly going to experience it. We already have. We already are. We're in the midst of it right now. There's an ongoing misinformation or disinformation campaign, I should say, about the credibility of our elections. It will continue. It will continue through November 5th, which is election day. And it will likely continue for several months, just as it did in 2020, until the final stamp is done. And when person puts their hand on the Bible on January 20th and swears in as the next president. But until then, we're going to live in disinformation environment. And one of the things I didn't say, but I was thinking about after is like, so what, right? Like, why does it matter? Like, okay, whatever. We're still gonna have a president. We're still gonna have a government. We're gonna still have, life. We're gonna be alive. We're gonna survive. Why does it matter? Well, when institutions, for example, in this case, a Luiken, and then the arbiter, the decision maker of, for example, elections is weakened and no longer believed, you then end up in a dynamic where in a democracy, it's not clear that the will of the people is elected. And so you have a push, and you have a push for power. And the disinformation, by weakening the elections and by weakening the institutions, gets rid of the arbiter. And so nobody really knows exactly what's happening or what's true. Now, if you take that by extension, let's say the American people in the instance of the election are not actually getting who they voted for, that could have real world consequences. For example, and I'll say it again, if one of the candidates wins and the man who's promoting disinformation, I believe, is Donald Trump, there is a plan to change the entirety of the way the U.S. government functions and is organized. There's a plan to fire civil servants. That means that, and put in political cronies. That means that people decided on grants to the Energy Department, at the Defense Department, in the Intel community, at the HHS. There'll be political hacks. They might not have any background or bio in any of the expertise that you all have. They may hand out contracts to their crony friends that may not have any value to society, the society that is paying for those actual programs through tax dollars. We need to get this right. Like, we need to have information that is true, verifiable, and based upon reality and reflects the popular opinion of the American people. It's okay if Donald Trump wins, but it needs to be a win that is seen as credible. And that means to not disinform the American people and delegitimize the institutions that would corroborate the victory. So I do think we're going to see this. I'll close with this. Is disinformation right now prior to the election to try to weaken Americans' confidence in vote totals. And then we will see litigation immediately pursued as of January 6th at midnight. I'm sorry, November 6th at midnight to go to courts to try to throw out and change and misdirect election results across the country, in particular in 7 or 8 key swing states that will determine the election that will likely be within tens of thousands of votes in each one. And need to see an ongoing battle about that and a massive quantity of disinformation. And I believe that's why the FBI took out its shot that it did, because this will be open season potential for foreign adversaries to use bots and magnify disinformation as a result, or in addition to that debate. And then we'll have to hope their institutions can hold forth and get to the truth of the matter and come up with decisions that our Congress will be able to validate and then lead to an inauguration that the American people have confidence in. That's what I hope. But hope springs eternal. I do believe in our democracy, but I do think that we're in a disinformation bubble already.
Okay, thank you. And Maike, I wanted to ask you, through your work on climate change, you've seen a lot of misinformation. So my question is, do you see information as one kind of umbrella category, or are there subcategories within this information umbrella that you've experienced through dealing with climate change?
So I guess I will. Okay, I just have to comment on this piece here. So are you looking for certification of truth? maybe we have to develop a truth certifier, if truth exists.
Just making sure that the people who vote get counted. No, just making sure the people who vote get counted. And also on climate, for example, we could have a government installed that is not legitimate, where people are making decisions on what funding or what to discuss, and maybe they'll just wipe out the words climate change, and that'll be the end of it, because then it won't exist.
Then we'll call it global warming again. So I think what I would do in terms of categorizing, I would look at trusted data and the information based on trusted data. And then I would go into predictions and modeling and how much we can rely on certain models and how well the predictions have been working. So I think there's a whole spectrum of information and its trustworthiness. And I think that would be one of the things to look at. And like when we say that X, Y, Z is going to happen, within which, level of confidence, the same as we do for election predictions, right? We have level of confidence associated with it. The other thing is that we've been talking about AI here. ChatGPT, I let it run my bio last year when it first came out. I had a degree in electrical engineering. I don't. I had it from UBC. I don't. It's from Waterloo and it's in physics and it's a PhD. It's not this, it's not that. I grew up in another country. The language of the bio was better than I could have ever written it, okay? My English third language, so what do you expect? But the fact was no fact. I had it written recently, like a week or two ago, I tried Perplexity. 100% on the money, every little piece. Bit shorter, but every little piece. So we have to look at the tools and their capabilities. Perplexity would give me a source after every sentence where it was pulled from, and I can go and verify it. ChatGPT, way back when, was refusing to give sources and now does. But I reran it again about 2 weeks ago, just because I wanted to do this test, and it's not working, like it still had hallucinations in there. And so I think when we talk about the different tools, we truly have to look at what are they made for, what are their capabilities. I can use an AI tool to look at satellite data that looks at the active layer of the permafrost in the north and calibrate that against ground observations and make predictions on where we have break-ins of coastlines and things like that. Okay, so it's another AI tool. If I want to procure a frigate, I don't think I can do it without AI today because it's just so much data. It is so complex, but it does not involve human data. And that's where the big difference is. When our discussion around data and information, we do have to not only talk about the information, the data, we have also to talk about the tools we use and their capabilities. And that gets us a whole bunch of categories.
Okay. Thank you very much. So now it's open to and people in the room and the people outside the room. You have a question?
Thank you very much. So I have a question specifically for Lisa, actually, and it's a bit technical, but I understand that we're going to put it in a non-technical terms. So I think, well, Zois discussed classification, and I think that is clear to everybody. We have data, some is labeled as misinformation, some is labeled as not, and we run a classifier. I'm sure that by now most people know what they do. They will learn to predict what's misinformation, what's not. Then we can do the same thing. I don't think it was mentioned. It can be done in an unsupervised learning where you don't have the labels, but you cluster the data together that looks similar. Now, Lisa several times mentioned reinforcement learning. And my way of understanding it, at least the way I teach it to my students, is imagine you're on a bicycle, you go a little bit too much on the left, you're going to fall, and that's your punishment. So the next time you go back on your bike, you go, this time you understand going on the left is not good, so you put your weight on the right, you fall on the right. And little by little, you will try to find the right position and you will learn. That's what reinforcement learning is. So what I'm curious about is whether you can explain how reinforcement learning is used in the context of misinformation detection, because I didn't really catch it.
Yeah, so thanks for I should have explained it, and that's a beautiful explanation of reinforcement learning. So the way that I've seen it used most effectively, and there have been many ways it's been used, but the way I've seen it used most effectively is to make this a decision as to whether or not a particular example is an example of the misinformation. So like in the example you were just saying, when it gets it right, and it is a good example that improves the model, it gets rewarded. And when it gets it wrong, it says it's a good example and it's a bad example, and the model performance decreases, then it's punished. And so the idea behind it is actually to teach it to identify new examples so that you don't have to label every single example, have a human labeler for every single example, which is why I call it a weak learner, because there's going to be some amount of error. But if that error can be kind of taught out of the reinforcement learner, that's great. I've also seen one other type of reinforcement learning that I'm excited about, but I think it's a little bit costly still right now. And that's the idea of cooperative agents that are working together, where each agent knows a different myth theme, and they're working together so that if one agent says, no, this is not anything to do with my myth, then they can send it to the other agents, and there's that knowledge that it has nothing to do with this one myth. And so I think that's a really interesting strategy moving forward, but it is more computationally expensive.
If you don't mind, can I ask a little more? So the reinforcement learning you're talking about is a bit of a mix with active learning, where it will seek new examples by doing some sort of distance measure based on the reward or the punishment. The reward it got, I guess the punishment is that the way it works? It's that it's rich, for example?
Yeah, so actually there was the way that I've seen it done is you have fact checkers, and you then have an unsupervised method like cosine similarity or some other similarity metric that makes the decision that it's close enough to that claim first. So that kind of the core exploration is sort of done with that step. And then these ones that have some level of similarity, the agent makes a decision on, in the reinforcement model.
Thank you very much, and sorry for boring everybody with those technical details.
Andre, did you have a question? Okay, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're attacking the wrong problem. If you read the news, according to the Washington Post, for 4 years, 30,573 lies were said. We had a debate not that long ago where one of the debaters complained that he was fact-checked. So what is it that what are you talking about detection? We already know, or at least half of the people know. But there were 70 million that voted for that individual that said 30,573 lies. So what are you talking about detecting?
One piece.
Right. But my point is that I would assume that everybody that is here has a higher level of education, and yet we are not going to the real problem caused by misinformation, because the fact is that the speed, I mean, people lied throughout lifetime. This is not a new thing.
Yeah.
But the speed to which it spreads is so fast, and it reaches everywhere. That is scaring. And
Yeah, so actually, none of us have talked about this, but I'm going to take a moment to, and I hope my colleagues will join me in talking about this. when I talked about 2016, I thought about detection first, because if you can't detect it, then you can't observe it, and then you can't intervene, right? So that's a first step. So maybe the first step is getting data. I think that was mentioned first. So having the data and then detecting it well enough that you're doing it so that you can then observe it and then finally intervene. So I would argue that the next generation of systems that we think about with respect to this misinformation epidemic that we're in actually is a system that connects all those components together, so that those once you detect a piece of misinformation, you observe it across different platforms. Once you observe it across different platforms, those that are spreading more rapidly, as you mentioned, are then candidates for interventions that we can do. And eventually, I mean, while there are humans in every step of this loop, eventually we can do this in such a systematic way that we can actually help people, when they have information, go to one of these observatories, ask if it's misinformation or not, and then, or disinformation, and then feel confident because of the sources that are specified as ways to move forward. So I think we all have thought about this. It's not that we're not thinking about all the different levels, it's that you have to get some of those earlier levels correct in order to do those interventions in an effective way.
Can you say something? I'm sorry. Uh, 1 second. Disinformation is actually the strength of the leader. You have to understand, people follow a strong leader. You have someone here who has been able to stop the IRS from condemning him, has been able to do a great deal about stopping the courts. This is the kind of leader that a number of people feel for. They feel protected by this kind of leader. So disinformation actually says, he is my liar. 30,000 lies, my God, these stupid Democrats, have been converted to dust. It is important to understand some of this research. That's why. I'm sorry, the panel needs to get on.
Yeah.
I feel you. I think some of the things that in confronting this and dealing with this is that we see the results in the real world of disinformation. Obviously 2016, but look, even in 2020, the disinformation, the propagandizing for months led thousands of Americans to riot at the Capitol. Not far from where I live, Pizzagate occurred. Anyone remember Pizzagate? That was the disinformation about alleged pedophilia and underweighing and Hillary Clinton. And then there's some guy drove up from North Carolina with a shotgun and shot up this restaurant thinking he was saving the kids, right? And then he testified he felt like a fool, right? Well, yeah. Disinformation. Now there are reports of people in North Carolina attacking National Guard who are there to help them, and FEMA workers who are there to help them because somehow they're not. So I don't know how we get at this except through brute, overwhelming truth and a consistent, repetitive, aggressive basis with as much loud amplification. I'll close with this. There are efforts organically driven to try to overwhelm the platforms with good information all the time. And it's these platforms. It's like the big unknown. I'm not going to be up here and advocate for censorship, but it's a little strange when one individual can own the single most powerful political social media platform in the world and then be out there basically biasing and pushing for one candidate and amplifying those messages and not others. And it's very frightening and troubling. And I don't think I have the answer in this moment. I know there's a lot of debate and discussion about it, but we're going to have that discussion at some point about what are the right rules and regulations for these. Are these public goods, or should these be like utilities? Should they be owned by the public and no longer out in private hands? How's that going to work? But that, to me, the platform dynamic is still the crucial nub of the problem.
Yeah, can I say something? Oh, yes. Okay, go ahead. In the comment here, just I want to say that your point is very valid, but I want to comment here and say that the technology already exists. So already there are a lot of models that can detect misinformation at a very early stage before it spreads. But here's one thing that contradicts with something else, and this is freedom of expression. So what if, let's say, I have a very powerful algorithm that can detect misinformation at a very early stage before it spreads out and becomes dangerous? I can easily block this account and couple more accounts that follow this account. Do I violate freedom of expression? That's a question, actually.
Thank you. Yes, I do. Can you hear me? Okay. So I was just thinking about, I have a similar comment, but I'll have my own take on it. Just thinking about, Ronald Reagan denying that there was an AIDS crisis, and now it's still, the leading cause of, it's a leading cause of death worldwide, and a global pandemic still 50 years later. George Bush lied about WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and the people bought into it, and we went into Iraq. I don't think that our political leaders and presidents in particular lying to the public is anything new. And those presidents were incredibly popular at the time, even among Democrats that voted for them. They won over 50% of the vote. And so my question is, what makes this context unique? And I can go even further back, or is this something, just very typically American? I don't know.
Well, I don't see any more questions here. Yeah, it's over there. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Oh, do you want me to ask it now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So regarding our discussion of sort of epistemic polarization, or rather the politicization of truth, and when one truth becomes a political statement versus another truth becoming a political statement. So my question sort of is, a lot of research out there indicates that when confronted with like brute force truth, as you mentioned, Joel, a lot of these individuals tend to overwhelmingly dig in their heels and further entrench themselves into their belief. So my question is it like, how do we, sway opinion and prevent misinformation after the damage has already been done? Because we talked about education as a means of preventing it from like a front end, but from the back end, is it even worth engaging with these types of people? Should you just disregard what they say, or is there still value in attempting to change what they believe in, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence that suggests that they're not going to change regardless of what we tell them?
Not going to ignore that one. Take the last one first, real quick. I mean, from a political perspective, I think one has to recognize that if they're not engaging in countering disinformation, misinformation, they're leaving a vacuum for that to fill the space, and that will become the standard of truth. A lot of politics is about convincing people in the middle. It's not necessarily cowing your opponent into submission where they recant everything they stood for and they disappear from the scene. No, but it's about ensuring that the broad middle, which is always up for grabs, and as we know in this instance, in this election, there really is a group of folks that for some reason can't make up their mind, but it's getting them to understand your perspective and hopefully the truthful perspective, not the disinforming perspective, and to over time whittle that down and disincentivize disinformation, right? That's the idea. That's the goal. The alternative is to allow it to proliferate uncontrolled. I don't want to dominate. Go ahead.
Lisa?
I'm going to take a little bit of a different take on this. So, do we always need to know the absolute truth? Or do we need to do a risk analysis of taking a particular decision? I'm hauling back to this original discussion around, was climate change real or not real? So, if it's not real and we don't do anything about it, no consequence. If it's not real, well, let's go to real. If it's real and we do something about it, good, then we might not have a disaster. If it's real and we don't do anything about it, then, we're in trouble. And I don't want to use, hard language here. But now comes the other side and says, we don't want to throw money out the window. Because if it's not real and we do something about it, we might be risking a lot of financial assets. But what is the benefit of doing something if it's not real? well, we get rid of a lot of pollution and so on and so on. So we have other benefits, health benefits and so on. So maybe a risk analysis in terms of the actions that we are considering is another way of dealing with mis and dis and out of date information. Just as a little strategy.
Okay, thank you very much. And a question over there.
I don't think we have answered.
Well, we'll answer first.
Then, did you have an answer for her? Her comment for her?
I forgot the question though.
Well, it's just be just generally what makes this context, unique today, with social media especially versus in the past when we've had political leaders straight out lie and become really popular. The public doesn't always value truth. That's an assumption that we make here that truth matters. It doesn't matter to them. So, it's kitchen table issues. Paying bills is an issue for them, not the truth necessarily.
I think what makes it different now than a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades ago is the speed with which it can proliferate and the fact that there isn't a common way we all get our news. So, a few decades ago, everybody watched the nightly news and there were a small number of channels. And even if it was more liberal or more conservative, there was some fundamental agreement on some set of facts. But now what we're seeing is we're seeing the fracturing of news at news streams. And so some people get no other news other than what is coming from their social network, their local church, their whatever little area. And that news is not based in the same facts that may have had that basis before. And I think that is the real scary part because the more and more the more people listen to that, the deeper it becomes a belief. And the more the belief becomes firm, the harder it is to convince them. I mean, you're going to be told that your belief is wrong, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. But if we don't have a similar set of facts that we base these beliefs on, then it becomes harder and harder to help people who are in that state. And going back to the other question, how do we do that or what should we do? I think it's incumbent upon us as a society to worry about those people the most because if they were given good information, they might have made different decisions. So us thinking about new strategies for providing high quality information to them, whether it's just, putting as much true information on the internet or facts on the internet as we can so they start to look at that or try to look at new information sources or whether there's some strategy we haven't thought of yet. I think we really do need to not ignore this because more and more people in isolation in these little areas without truth could cause larger problems.
Maybe I want to add one sentence to what is different now compared to the past. I think also the volume is making it has an impact. So the amount of information that we receive today is huge. If you think about that, you can just scroll down and get everything. While in the past, we were just watching TV for 1 hour and getting a couple of pieces of information, right? So the amount of information that we get inside, we do not have actually the capacity to edit or to think about. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Andre?
Thanks. I want to put something to the panel and then just ask your views on this. It really spins off from the last question. I want to start by reading 2 quotes. The first one says, "Comment is free, but facts are sacred." Okay, that's a quote from C.P. Scott, the editor of the Manchester Guardian, in an essay from 1921. The other one from the US, from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. So I think this goes back to Zois's comment earlier. What if someone is saying something wrong? It hasn't gone viral yet. We know it's wrong. We know it could spread, but it hasn't caused that harm yet. Is there a legitimate public interest in stopping it, or is that censoring speech? And I want to put the idea to you that social media does change the game And therefore, there could be an obligation on platforms that they can have rules that take down that comment even that early. It doesn't stop the person saying rubbish. They just can't say it in a broadcast medium. Okay, they can't say it in a platform with the capacity to take it viral. Can I ask the platform your views on that and how you see that sort of rule impacting the balance between freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and protecting the public interest, including democracy and the public good?
I mean, you're hitting on, frankly, the hardest question that we have to date and how to deal with this. I was thinking about the debate about smoking for years in this country. And, what do you do about smoking? How do you, stop people from smoking, reduce cancer, et cetera, et cetera? Well, you put a label, you put a label. Says this is hazardous to your health. That'll do it. Eventually, people realized that it didn't do it. That wasn't doing it. So what they do? Well, laws started getting passed to ban smoking from restaurants, to ban smoking from airplanes, to ban smoking from bars, to ban smoking from next to entrances where you could walk out, through a building and into a waft of smoke everywhere. Eventually, it's sorry. I hope you're not smoking. No, eventually it's been gone and it's had an impact. And I do think at a certain point, this question of the common good and protecting the common good matters. And I'm not sure, I'm not yet comfortable with saying yes, you're banned if you say a lie, right? Like that's a really Orwellian dynamic. But at the same time, if there's a way to not just label, but to actively dissuade uh, disinformation from proliferating, that can have some good. And just for full disclosure, Andre and I worked together in years past on disinformation related to online white supremacist radicalization and anti-Semitism, and calling it out was crucial. Looking at the law to try to figure out what is language that could lead to direct harm in the real world of people, and how to call that out and try to get legislation to move in that direction. Not an easy target, but I don't think just labeling it and walking away is good enough. I think that's proven itself that the labeling just people just will ignore it. There has to be more overt, active effort to call it disinformation rather than just say this is disinformation and move on.
Okay, I think there's one more over there.
I want to add one more thing here because I really like the comment. Ban is part of the solution. I think complementing education is also part, because while smoking was banned, at the same time it was also promoted as an unhealthy habit. So people actually stayed away, not only because they got fines, but because also they realized that it's doing something bad for their health.
Okay. Did you have a question back there?
So,
No, maybe not then.
okay, so I think we'll wind the panel up there. I do want to make one comment before we do, just on the smoking. I don't know if people are aware of this, but the introduction of vaping has completely turned around all the progress that was made on smoking.
The attorney generals from 46 states sued big tobacco. They did. There was a there was a lawsuit that resulted in a settlement. And that settlement had education as part of it. There was anti-smoking advertising that went along with it. So there was a model here in the United States where there were actually, the state's attorneys general brought a suit against Lorillard and Philip Morris and some of the big tobacco companies. So that model is important. We have seen that. I understand your point about vaping because we seem to be going backward, but we do have a historical model where there was legal action taken that we should look to here and not forget about. Thank you.
Hey, I was just going to say that YouTube and TikTok do take down videos that have certain types of content. So there's no reason we can't do that.
Can I finish? We do need a trusted place for information and fact, and of course updated fact. And that was talking about terminology. We need to do the same thing with what we believe at a certain time to be a fact, and we need a place where people have access to trusted information, trusted data, trusted fact.
Okay, thank you very much.